Well, I was asked to begin by making a couple of statements that are completely unimportant, so it doesn't matter if you don't hear them, and that gives the sound man a chance to fix his equipment. It ought to be easy to say things that are very unimportant, but when you're asked to do it, it's somehow difficult. I don't know why. How's that? Unimportant enough? Did that work? Yeah. Okay. Good. There have been various difficulties of communication about exactly how to frame this evening's talk. When I was first asked to talk about Lebanese-Syrian relations, I said, glad to talk about the United States and the Middle East and things I know something about, but I don't really know very much about Lebanese-Syrian relations. I have nothing much to say about it. I shall say a few things toward the end, but will only just express view on the subject. I was opposed to the entry of the Syrian army into Lebanon in 1976, when it was welcomed by the United States and Israel, because its task at that time was to slaughter Palestinians, as it did quite successfully, Al-Zatar and other massacres. And I've remained opposed to its presence over the years, and I don't think it should be present now. With regard to acts of terror like yesterday's bombing, we should all, of course, deplore those, and we might remember the major single terrorist bombing in Beirut, which happened just 20 years ago. I'm now excluding aggression, massive atrocities, Ariel bombing, and so on, just keeping to terrorist acts. The worst terrorist bombing, what did yesterday's killed, I think, 12 people. The worst one killed about 80 people, mostly women and girls, injured a couple hundred others. It was a truck bomb placed outside a mosque, timed to go off just when people left. Huge explosion. The target of the bomb was a Muslim cleric. He escaped, but many others didn't. That terrorist bombing, however, is out of history because it violates a crucial condition. It was traced back to the CIA, and therefore it didn't happen. So it's not part of the record of terrorism, along with mass other things like it. So it may have happened, but it's not part of history. And I'll talk about a lot of other things that may have happened, but aren't part of history. In the background interchange about today's event, at one point, maybe now, an abstract was proposed which had to do with the U.S., the prospects for democracy, independence, peace in the Middle East, and the U.S. Double standards with regard to those issues over the past years. That's a topic I think I can talk about, so I will. However, I'm always uncomfortable when the question of double standards comes up. The term is understandable, but I think it's quite misleading. It would be more reasonable, I think, to accept the conclusions of the most of the scholars who are the most enthusiastic advocates and participants in what are called these days democracy promotion projects, the leading theme of U.S. foreign policy. The most prominent of them is the director of the Democracy and Rule of Law project at the Carnegie Endowment, Thomas Carruthers. He describes himself as a neo-Reaganite and hopes that Reagan's profound commitment to democracy promotion will in fact be the guiding principle for U.S. Foreign policy. That's his role at the Carnegie Endowment, leading the project. He has a book that just came out which reviews the post-Cold War experience in democracy promotion, and I'll just quote you from it. He finds what he calls a strong line of continuity. Where democracy appears to fit in well with U.S. security and economic interests, the United States promotes democracy. Where democracy clashes with other significant interests, it's downplayed or ignored. Actually, you can take that statement and replace the United States by any other country you like, Stalinist Russia, fascist Japan, whatever, and the same statement will be true, from which a rational person will draw some conclusions, perhaps, about the project of democracy promotion. That's the standard, the major work since on the post-Cold War experience with the project since 1990. There's also a standard scholarly work on democracy promotion in the 1980s, also written by Thomas Carruthers, this is concentration on Latin America, which was the testing area for democracy promotion in the 80s. And he's very well placed to write about that, not only as a highly regarded scholar, but also as an insider. He was an official in the State Department, Reagan State Department, in the what were called the democracy enhancement programs. So he writes both as a scholar and an insider. And he describes the programs of the 1980s as sincere, but a failure. And as he points out, a highly systematic failure. In the areas where U.S. influence was least, in the southern cone of the hemisphere, progress in democracy was greatest. And as he points out, the Reagan administration tried hard to block the progress of democracy there, but finally had to accept it. In the regions where U.S. influence was greatest, he says, points out, democracy promotion was least. And he also gives the reasons. That's the region near the United States, Central America, and Caribbean, traditional area of U.S. control. The reason, he says, is that the U.S. government, the Reagan administration, was willing to accept only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. Washington sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies and to avoid populist-based change. In other words, the same strong line of continuity through the 80s and into the post-war period. Well, if you look back into the earlier years, not particularly controversial, you find the same strong line of continuity. The U.S. regularly overthrew democratic parliamentary governments, installed brutal and vicious tyrannies. Iran, Guatemala, Brazil, Chile, long list, no need to run through them. All of this was explained away case by case as having to do with the needs of the Cold War, which led to all sorts of regrettable actions. If you look at the examples carefully, and there's plenty of information about them, rich documentary record, you find that the Cold War had virtually no relevance, at most marginal, sometimes none. But let's put that aside. The crucial point here is that the strong line of continuity extends as far back as we go. Carruthers, incidentally, in the book that just came out a couple of months ago, predicts the same in Iraq, same line of continuity. Remember, I'm not quoting a critic, but one of the most enthusiastic advocates and participants, and perhaps the most prominent scholar in the area. So the conclusion is there isn't any double standard, there's a single standard. The single standard is the one he quotes. He says, where democracy appears to fit in well with U.S. security and economic interests, the U.S. promotes democracy. Where democracy clashes with significant interests, it's downplayed or ignored, which is a little bit of an understatement. It's also overthrown. That's a single standard, and it is indeed a strong line of continuity. Now, to the extent that there's a double standard, it's the conflict between consistent practice and consistent pronouncements. There's a clear conflict. But the pronouncements, here we can just invoke what ought to be a familiar truism. Declarations of virtuous intent by political leaders are completely predictable, and therefore they carry zero information, even in the technical sense. Any sensible person just disregards them, so we don't care about the noble rhetoric, and indeed it was noble and uplifting, produced by Hitler, Stalin, the Japanese fascists, in fact, anybody you can think of. Predictable, uninteresting, zero information. If you're rational, you disregard it. So there is, again, a single standard. It's the expected one. Like other powers, the U.S. government pursues what it calls security and economic interests. Democracy is irrelevant, apart from propaganda purposes. It's consistently proclaimed, but that's normal, and the U.S. is constantly praised by its educated classes, media, and so on for its noble commitments, but that's also predictable and carries zero information and is to be disregarded if we want to understand anything about the world. If you look a little closer, what are called security interests actually have very little to do with security, at least if security means something relating to protection of the country and its population. That's not a high priority, very consistently. Rather, what we find consistently is what we, in fact, discover in documents that are intended for domestic consumption, internal consumption, not to the population, but internal to the government. So Clinton's, take, say, the Clinton Doctrine, presented to Congress by Clinton administration, which declared that the United States will resort to unilateral use of military power, if necessary, to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. That's an accurate description, and there is a very strong line of continuity right until this moment, tracing back as far as you like, and it's not specific to the United States. It's true of any great power, any power within its own realm, the United States within most of the world because of its unusual, in fact, unique, historically unique power. For these reasons, I think talk about double standards is very misleading. It's more realistic to speak of a single standard, both in practice and in doctrine. In practice, the single standard is pursuit of economic and strategic interests. In doctrine, the single standard is proclamation of virtuous intent and praise for our own virtue by those whose task it is to carry that out. And in both cases, it's pretty close to a historical universal. I think the United States is not different from other great powers, past or present. Let's take a look at democracy promotion today. There are two major issues, both in the Middle East. One is Iraq, and one is Israel-Palestine. Come back to Syria, Lebanon later. That's a little off this topic. Question is, do these two cases depart from the strong line of continuity that reaches back as far as we like? Is the head of the Carnegie Endowment Project correct in predicting more of the same in Iraq? Well, let's take a look. Iraq just, of course, had elections, which are highly heralded, and indeed were quite successful, and I think are to be praised. However, their main success is rarely mentioned, if ever. The main success is that the United States was compelled against its will to allow them to take place. That's a triumph, a significant triumph of nonviolent resistance, one that should be recognized. Through very dedicated mass nonviolent resistance, the U.S. was forced to back down from its strong opposition to elections and finally to accept them. The symbol of this nonviolent resistance is the Ayatollah Sistani. Again, the U.S. sought in every possible way to avoid elections, but was compelled to back down step by step, and we're now in the midst of the same process today. Let me just keep to the New York Times. and discuss how it's been describing this step by step. So I'll start a year ago with Paul Wolfowitz, who's regarded as the leader of the democracy crusade, the idealist in chief, as he's described by the Washington Post. A year ago, Wolfowitz and his Pentagon staff, I'm quoting the New York Times, are signaling that they favor a sizable, prolonged U.S. troop presence in Iraq and a relatively weak Iraqi army as the best way to nurture democracy. Won't comment on the phrase, nurture democracy under strong military occupation. That was straight out of Orwell. You'd think they'd be a little more imaginative. At the time, there was a so-called government. The U.S. appointed interim leaders, but as the Times points out, they refused to negotiate these troop agreements because they were bound, not because they didn't want to, but because they were compelled by public opinion to reject them. Times points out that that's a serious problem. Quote, this is a year ago, the delay could put the Americans in the position of negotiating an agreement with leaders they did not appoint on such sensitive issues as when the use of force would be allowed. And that's a real dilemma if you're committed to democracy. Going on, the Bush administration officials said that the United States is planning a long-term military relationship with the emerging government of Iraq, one that would grant the Pentagon access to military bases and project American influence into the heart of the unsettled region. Unsettled region means the major world's major energy-producing regions. Now, there are going to be problems with an elected government if we're forced to accept it, they point out. So therefore, what's called the Coalition Provisional Authority, the U.S. occupying forces, proposed a caucus system, which, to quote the Times, a caucus system which they could tweak to look more democratic without changing it in a fundamental way. The UN would be invited in, but I'm quoting still, Washington is asking it to endorse a future Iraqi government of only nominal sovereignty and questionable legitimacy, by whose invitation the occupying powers would remain in place. Okay, those are the plans for democracy and independence as of a year ago. And they added that U.S. officials say they believe they have found a legal basis for American troops to continue their military control over the security situation in Iraq. That means over Iraq, whatever Iraqis may think. They also announced that they intended to write the constitution for the future government. Well, all of this was blocked step by step by nonviolent resistance that included fatwas from Sistani, mass popular demonstrations, and so on. And so matters continued until, by the end, the United States, with, of course, Britain padding politely behind, had no recourse but to allow the elections, which, of course, are presented as a U.S. initiative once it can no longer be avoided. The fully documented history goes to the usual place for unwanted truths to be quickly forgotten. As the U.S. was forced to accept the elections, it immediately moved to undermine them in any possible way it could. Independent media, particularly Al Jazeera, were kicked out of the country to ensure that only the right voices would be heard. The U.S. Did whatever it could to ensure that its own candidates, it's primarily Iyad Alawi, would be the only ones to have access to state resources for presenting themselves to the public, publicity, propaganda, and so on. In fact, most of the candidates remained unidentified. But the U.S. couldn't block the elections. And greatly to the distress of Washington, its own candidate trailed very far behind. Well, there's a question now. That brings us up till today. The question now is whether the United States can be compelled to accept the outcome. Now, there's very little doubt from polls, even from the most hawkish and most respected specialists like Anthony Cortizman, very little doubt that most people voted with the hope that it would end the occupation. Actually, that was a leading plank of the victorious Shiite alliance. leading plank was that the U.S. must present a timetable for withdrawal. Tony Blair immediately declared his love of democracy by stating at once, not even waiting for the numbers to come in, that prospect was not contemplated. Washington declared right away that U.S. forces would stay there into 2007, the timetable, whatever Iraqis and their government may want. Interesting review of this in the Wall Street Journal, which the correspondent there, who pointed out that the elected officials were promising that they would call for withdrawal of the occupying army, and the U.S. is trying to finesse this in some way to get around it, and it's hoping to, quoting it, to secure an agreement on a vague promise to withdraw eventually. The idea is you can coerce them enough, maybe they'll agree to a vague promise. Well, we keep the troops there as long as we want and run the country as long as we want. Well, military control is only one part of it. There's a whole host of other issues. The Coalition Provisional Authority instituted a whole array of totally illegal economic measures, legal structure and economic measures, which had the goal of opening up the country completely to takeover by foreign, meaning mostly U.S. interests. The question is whether the U.S. can twist enough arms to keep that structure in place after there's a formally elected government. The U.S. has a favorite. You can read about it on the front page of the Times and elsewhere, a favorite for prime minister. He happens to be the oil minister of the U.S. appointed interim government, and a couple of weeks ago he announced his plans to open up the oil industry too, completely to foreign, meaning mainly U.S. takeover. So not surprisingly, he's the favorite for the prime minister. That's Abdul Mahdi. So in brief, without going into further details, there's a strong line of continuity, and it continues unchanged. And there are sure to be continuing struggles over these matters. And in fact, here we can turn to something more important, namely, there will be a major effort, of course, to project imagery about how the free and sovereign government of Iraq has chosen willingly to accept U.S. military occupation, and the U.S. designed legal and economic structure, that's for sure. But that's normal. That's simply, to go back to Carruthers, a matter, as in Central America, the standard position of accepting only limited top-down forms of democratic change that do not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied, and maintaining the basic order of quite undemocratic societies to avoid populist-based change. Well, that's in Central America and the Caribbean, the traditional region of U.S. control, and it's not surprising to find the same principles applied elsewhere. At this point, there's a lot that can be done here to pressure the U.S. government to permit something at least remotely resembling the inspired rhetoric that is produced in Washington and echoed in the media and commentary. That's a choice for us. Well, let's turn to the second case, Israel-Palestine. There's also a lot of enthusiasm now about the recent Sharon Abbas truce, and like the Iraqi elections, it's to be welcomed. It's better to have no killing than killing. However, we should not overlook the fact that the truce is a tremendous victory for U.S.-Israeli rejectionism. The framework that was established is entirely, without exception, the rejectionist framework that Israel has, of course, followed and the U.S. has led for the last over 30 years. So the one substantive element in the truce is that all Palestinian resistance to the occupation must cease. That includes resistance against military forces that have been occupying the country, the regions, the territory since 1967. That's it. That's the only substantive part of the agreement, and naturally that's much in the interest of the occupying power and their sponsor and funder. There isn't a single word in the discussion about what has always been the core issue, namely the programs of the U.S.-Israeli takeover of the valuable parts of the territories, the valuable land, the resources, water particularly, and so on. That's to continue without change. Also, the huge infrastructure projects that are being developed to break up the West Bank into unviable cantons in which those Palestinians who remain will somehow be sequestered. Not a word about that. These projects are just to continue unhindered by any peace agreement. That's why they're not mentioned. There's not a word in the agreement about the wall that Israel's building, funded by the United States as always, that Israel's building, cutting right through the West Bank. That's the, whatever you want to call it, the separation wall. It's alleged to be for security, but 2 minutes thought shows it can't possibly be for security. There are other, if they wanted to build a wall, there's a way to build one that'll yield security, and it's not this one. But it does take over a very valuable land and resources, including water resources and the land that's in what's called the seam, the region between the wall and the international border. It's the seam, which happens to be quite valuable land and does happen to be on top of the major water resources, which are crucial. The building of the wall, of course, overrules the judgment of the World Court, which just recently declared the wall to be illegal. That judgment was passed with only one dissenting voice. The dissenting voice was the U.S. Justice. However, the U.S. Justice, though dissented only on technical grounds. If you look at his dissent, he agreed with the judgment. He agreed with the crucial points in the judgment, namely that all settlements are illegal on either side of the wall, and that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories, which means that any transfer of population there is a breach of the Geneva Conventions, and despite everything the U.S. and Israel are doing there, is a breach, often a grave breach, of the Geneva Conventions that the U.S. Justice agreed with. So that was a unanimous decision of the World Court. Irrelevant because the U.S. is opposed to it, so therefore it's disregarded and, of course, unmentioned in the peace agreements, and virtually not a word about it either at the time or since in the press or other commentary. Also unmentioned is that the U.S. happens to have a legal code which includes the War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by a Republican Congress, which declares that the grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions are not only crimes, but are subject to the death penalty for the executive who orders them. That's part of the reason why the President's legal counsel, Alberto Gonzales, now Attorney General, advised President Bush a couple of years ago in a memo that he should effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions, which would, as he explained, would reduce the likelihood of prosecution for crimes. He didn't go on to say crimes that carry the death sentence. That's part of the background for the appointment of our new Attorney General, which raises a few other questions about democracy promotion, but I'll keep to the Middle East. In this regard, disregarding international law, Geneva Conventions, war crimes, and so on, the recent Sharon Abbas truce is very similar to what happened in Oslo in 1993, September 1993, what the Boston Globe described as a day of awe when there was a handshaking on the White House lawn. At that time, the PLO, meaning the outside Tunis leadership, which essentially undercut the Palestinian delegation to reach that agreement, the PLO leadership accepted the Clinton Doctrine, which was, in Clinton administration's words, that UN resolutions are obsolete and anachronistic. Okay. So whatever they said, we can forget about, they're out of history, inapplicable, including those the U.S. theoretically back. And that meant that settlement and infrastructure development could continue without pause right through the Oslo years, as it did, steadily. Take a look at the level of settlement through the Oslo years. It goes up quite steadily. It didn't matter which government was in office. In fact, the peak year for the highest rate of settlement happened to be the year 2000, Clinton's last year, and Barack's last year. And that continues too. Settlement was up another 6% last year. It's now up to about 450,000. That's including what's called East Jerusalem, which is a huge area of the West Bank that Israel annexed after vast expanding the borders of Jerusalem, annexed in violation of the repeated Security Council orders declaring it illegal. Those happen to have been voted for also by the United States, but as Clinton pointed out, the UN resolutions are obsolete and anachronistic, along with international law or anything else that gets in the way. So that continues, also unreported. You have to look pretty hard to find any reference to it. Well, there actually is a more general issue. What I just said should have been the headlines in the newspapers after the Abbas, Sharon truce. Those are the crucial issues. But you can try it and see if you can find even a mention of the wrong kind of story. Another wrong kind of story is a more general issue that lies in the background. In December 1987, under strong pressure from the Reagan administration, the UN General Assembly passed the UN's strongest resolution ever, condemning terrorism, what Reagan had called the evil scourge of terrorism, the plague of the modern age, and so on, condemning terrorism in all its forms, demanding that all states combine to put an end to this plague. That's December 1987, very important resolution. It was passed almost unanimously. Only one country abstained, Honduras, and only 2 countries voted against it, the usual 2, the United States and Israel. Now, why should the United States and Israel vote against the strongest condemnation of terrorism passed under U.S. influence? Well, they explained the reasons in the UN debate. There was an offending paragraph which they couldn't accept. The paragraph said that nothing in this resolution interferes with, I'm quoting, the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence as derived from the Charter of the United Nations of people forcibly deprived of that right, particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation. And clearly the United States and Israel couldn't accept that. The phrase racist and colonialist regimes was understood to mean South Africa, apartheid South Africa, a very close ally of the United States and Israel. Remember, at that time, in 1988, the U.S. Pentagon declared that Nelson Mandela's African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world, and South Africa was a proper democratic country which had just killed about 1.5 million people in the surrounding countries, Angola and Mozambique, during the period of Reagan support. That's during the period of what's called constructive engagement. So obviously there can't be a right of resistance against racist and colonialist regimes. Foreign military occupation, of course, referred to Israel, so that couldn't be accepted. So therefore, it was impossible for the U.S. and Israel, and they're the only 2 in the world, to vote for the strongest condemnation of terrorism. Well, this is the wrong story, obviously. So none of this was reported at the time, and it's all out of history. But coming back to, that's part of the joy of living in a free society where we're under no coercion to adhere to be slavish supporters of state power. It's done willingly, not by coercion. Coming back to the truce agreement, notice that the U.S. and Israel have now won that battle. Up until then, there was never any rejection of the right of resistance in accord with the UN Charter to racist and colonial regimes and the foreign military occupation. But this recent agreement now declares that the resistance is illegal, illegitimate. The U.S. declares it to be illegitimate. Military occupation is therefore legitimate. No resistance tolerable, of course, as long as it's military occupation by the United States or a client. That's a great victory for the rule of force and a demonstration of the single standard, both in policy and in doctrine. In doctrine, because of course it's unreported and unmentioned and can't appear in any commentary, nor can the background which I just mentioned. Well, let's go back to what's omitted in the truce, the core issue, namely the U.S.-backed Israeli expansion into the West Bank. Turn to the Washington Post this time, just for variety. The other national paper, it reports a couple days ago that Israel is building a concrete wall. That's part of the illegal separation wall. Building a concrete wall through Abu Dis as part of a project to separate the West Bank from Israel. Now, that terminology is interesting. The wall is now to separate the West Bank from Israel. That means that the Washington Post has recognized the annexation by Israel of the scene, the region between the wall and the international border. The Post is telling us that, yes, that's now part of Israel. We annexed it. That's not inconsistent with George Bush's recent pronouncements, saying that the settlements are going to be permanent. And this goes with an earlier and very important pronouncement of his, also therefore unreported, in December 2002, when the U.S. officially reversed its policy with regard to so-called Jerusalem. Up until then, at least theoretically, the U.S. had backed the UN resolutions declaring all Israeli actions in occupied Jerusalem illegal, in violation of international law, crimes under the Geneva Convention. That included the annexation, the building, the expansion to a large part of the West Bank. But in December 2002, for the first time, the United States at the General Assembly voted against the resolution, reiterating this long-standing decision of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Long story, so passed unmentioned. The U.S. wasn't alone in voting against that. Israel voted against it, and they picked up, I think, Micronesia, maybe Palau or somebody like that. Usual votes in the General Assembly. Let's go back to Abu Dis, where the wall is it's passing through Abu Dis. What's that? Abu Dis is a village outside of Jerusalem. Now it's part of Greater Jerusalem because the U.S. and Israel expanded the borders in violation of Security Council resolutions. Abu Dis was supposed to be the capital of some future Palestinian state. The idea of that was so that the Palestinians could then say that they have a capital in Jerusalem by the divisive renaming. We take something that's outside of Jerusalem and we decide to call it Jerusalem, so therefore they get a capital in Jerusalem. Now it's reduced. It's a slice of Abu Dis that'll be the potential capital of something called a state. Actually, the first mention of a Palestinian state that I can find in Israeli discussion is not the doves. Rabin and Peres and the rest flatly refused any mention of a Palestinian state as long as they were in office. The first mention that I can find is in the Netanyahu government, the ultra-right government that came in 1996. Its Minister of Information was asked, would Israel ever accept a Palestinian state? And he said, well, yeah, we're going to leave them some territory to concentrate them in the occupied territories, and they can call that a state if they like, or they can call it fried chicken. That's, as far as I'm aware, the first recognition of the idea of a Palestinian state, I think 1996, after the doves were out. Well, that's supposed to be Abu Dis. Going back to the Washington Post report of the wall cutting through it, Post claims that the project was suspended after it was reported internationally. And what that means is the project will continue, except quietly. Report it anymore. That's what it's meant in the past. The point of the project, Post says, is to close the gap between Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem. Okay, so what's Ma'ale Adumim? Well, Ma'ale Adumim is a town that was built mostly under Clinton with the purpose of bisecting the West Bank. Borders actually extend virtually to Jericho, and once it's connected to Jerusalem, that creates a salient which effectively divides the West Bank into two parts. There's another salient further to the north, which is also included in the wall, which divides the rest into two parts, pretty much. That's Ma'ale Adumim, mostly a Clinton project, is going to provide a site for the new headquarters of Israel's police force in the West Bank. That'll be the independent, sovereign West Bank. The old headquarters of the police force was in East Jerusalem, quoting the Post, which is now available for conversion into apartments for Jews. That's illegally annexed, expanded East Jerusalem. Post goes on to say that the Ma'ale Adumim plan is part of an expansion plan officially known as E1, which anti-settlement activists said is the final step in sealing off North and East Jerusalem from Palestinians living in the West Bank. And it's going to double the size of Ma'ale Adumim to 60,000. It goes on to say U.S. officials have opposed the plan for years. Presumably they expressed this opposition quietly and politely while they were handing over the checks for the building of Ma'ale Adumim in the past 10 years. It's the only record there is of opposition, but that's kind of a ritual comment. You have to say that the U.S. is so weak and impotent that it couldn't do anything about its opposition except to fund the development of Ma'ale Adumim. Well, with a little research, the Post could have found out that the E1 project is not new. In fact, it traces back to the beginning of the Oslo process, and it goes back to the Doves, the Rabin and Peres Dovish labor governments right after Oslo. Now, they announced right away, unreported here, but you can read it in the Israeli press, that they announced right away that they were going to construct 2 rings around the Greater Jerusalem. First expand Jerusalem, then construct 2 rings around it. E1 was a core part of the first ring. That's the one that links Ma'ale Adumim, the town then being built, links Ma'ale Adumim to Jerusalem. Actually, something already existed. It was being greatly expanded under Clinton. Shimon Peres is the super dove. His housing minister, Fuad Ben Eliezer, reported in 1996 that Fuad does everything quietly with the complete protection of the prime minister, using such terms as natural growth instead of new settlements when he implements the labor government's policies of expanding Greater Jerusalem to include Ma'ale Adumim, Givat Ze'ev, Beitar as the first circle of settlements surrounding Jerusalem, to which another chain of settlements will be added later. The leading labor dove, most well-known and prominent, Yossi Beilin, he was critical of the Netanyahu government. He said, the Rabin government, doves, us, we increased settlements by 50% in the West Bank after Oslo, but we did it quietly and with wisdom, unlike the right wing, who proclaim your intentions every morning, frighten the Palestinians, and transform the topic of Jerusalem as the unified capital of Israel, a matter which all Israelis agree upon, into a project of worldwide debate. A project that all Israelis agree upon, and the U.S. government, but not the U.S. population, incidentally, is in gross violation of Security Council resolutions and international law and the Geneva Conventions. But Beilin does correctly describe the basic difference between the two political groupings, both of them acting with U.S. support. One does things quietly and sensibly, the other loudly and brazenly, which is kind of foolish. And in fact, we might say something similar about the political spectrum in the United States, but I'm not talking about that. After Yasser Arafat was elected, after he died, a couple of months ago, elections were held. This is regarded widely as a turning point in the history of the Middle East. The New York Times, of course, had a page-one story about it after his death, with the headline, "Hoping Democracy Can Replace a Palestinian Icon." What exactly does that mean? Actually, Arafat had been elected in a very closely supervised democratic election, but the U.S. later turned against him, which meant that that wasn't democracy. So now he can be replaced by democracy. Actually, Abbas, who was elected, has been there before. Mentioned that in December 2002, the Bush administration formally reversed the long-standing official U.S. position on the critical matter of the status of Jerusalem, that declaring the annexation legal and the expansion, that essentially eliminates any residual possibility of a negotiated settlement if the vote is taken seriously. About the same time, Bush declared the arch-terrorist Sharon a man of peace, right in the midst of his further depredations in the territories. And Bush demanded that Arafat, who was no longer fulfilling his role satisfactorily, be replaced by a prime minister who can be expected to meet U.S.-Israeli demands, namely Mahmoud Abbas. Although, I'm now quoting the New York Times, unlike Mr. Arafat, Abbas does not have a popular following, but that has no effect on his bringing democracy. It provides further illustration of the president's, what's called his vision of democracy, and in fact the long-standing commitment to democracy, the strong line of continuity. Shortly after that, Bush announced what the Boston Globe called his messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East. And while doing so, he endorsed the imprisonment of the one elected Arab leader in the Arab world, namely Arafat's imprisonment in his compound in Ramallah by the man of peace. Draw your conclusions from that. Let's go back to the New York Times story, the page-one story on the death of Arafat. It says, it opens by saying, the post-Arafat era will be the latest test of a quintessentially American article of faith, that elections provide legitimacy even to the frailest institutions. That's the first paragraph, page one. You go to the continuation page, to the last paragraph, where you often find something interesting. It reads, the paradox for the Palestinians is rich, however. In the past, the Bush administration resisted new national elections among the Palestinians. The thought was that the elections would make Mr. Arafat look better and give him a fresher mandate, and might help give credibility and authority to Hamas. So therefore, couldn't have elections. So what's the quintessentially American faith? Elections are fine if they come out the way we say they must. Otherwise, to the flames. Again, the same strong line of continuity, expressed very clearly, running right till today, with its always paradoxical quality, namely our deeds consistently conflict with our words. It's called the double standard, but it's an easier way to describe it in plain English. Well, we can learn a little more about how much time I've got. How much time do I have? Now, let me skip a long discussion, which is quite interesting, actually, about the treatment of the death of Arafat, which actually reveals quite a lot, but I'll skip it, and turn finally to a couple of words about Syria. See how the strong line of continuity works here. Well, Syria, as I'm sure you know, is on the list of states supporting terrorism. During the years in which that list has existed, since 1979, only one state has ever been removed from the list, namely Iraq. Saddam Hussein was removed from the list by the Reagan administration in 1982, so that the U.S. would be free to provide military and other aid to its friend Saddam Hussein. This continued right through his worst atrocities, which are now declared to be the reason for overthrowing him. The U.S. continued to support him long after the war with Iran, which had absolutely nothing to do with it. Actually, the reasons were explained publicly right when George Bush #1 authorized Saddam to crush the Shiite rebellion that would have been likely to overthrow him in 1991, so after the first Gulf War. It was explained that Washington felt that Saddam Hussein offered more hope for stability than those who were trying to overthrow him. Stability means obedience to the United States. The principle was and is that Iraqis must not be permitted to govern Iraq. That's a strong line of continuity running right up till the present. There actually is one other case, apart from Saddam Hussein, where the U.S. offered to remove a state from the list of states supporting terror, namely Syria. In 1993, Clinton offered to remove Syria from the list of states supporting terror if Syria would agree to the peace terms offered by the U.S. and Israel. Okay, Syria insisted on recovering its territory, which had been conquered in 1967, after the ceasefire, incidentally. And because Syria refused to accept U.S. orders, it remained on the list of states supporting terrorism. And so that gives you a good operational definition of what supporting terrorism means, namely refusing U.S. orders. And it's still on the list, despite acknowledgments by U.S. intelligence that Syria hasn't been even implicated in any terrorist acts for years and has been highly cooperative in providing intelligence to the United States about the radical Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda and others, who it doesn't like one bit. As a reward for Syria's cooperation in the so-called war on terror, in December 2004, Congress almost unanimously passed strong legislation calling for even stricter sanctions against Syria. It's the Syria Accountability Act. They were implemented by the president, thereby depriving the United States of a major source of information about radical Islamist terrorism in order to achieve the higher goal of establishing in Syria a regime that will accept U.S.-Israeli demands. That's not an unusual pattern. Actually, concern about terrorism is a very low priority in policy planning, ranking maybe right around democracy. There are many illustrations of this. The most obvious one is right in front of everyone's eyes, namely the invasion of Iraq. That was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably increase the threat of terror, as in fact it did. A national intelligence estimate was presented to the president in January, right before the invasion, which said, invasion is likely to increase the threat of terror. Last December, the National Intelligence Council, which collects all the intelligence agencies, issued its projection for the next 15 years, and it concluded that as a result of the invasion, Iraq could replace Afghanistan for recruitment, training grounds, and technical skills for a new class of professionalized terrorists who can disperse around the world, as predicted. Another of many illustrations, easy to go on, of the fact that terror is simply not a high priority as compared with the usual strategic and economic objectives that guide policy. Takes real talent to miss this, not only in this case, which is glaring, but in the Syria case and innumerable others. But the fact is, it's kind of like democracy. Well, I'll finish by pointing out that the Syria Accountability Act offers another striking illustration of the single standard that's called a double standard. The core demand, you read the Syria Accountability Act, you find that its core demand refers to a UN Security Council resolution, namely Resolution 520, which called for respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon, violated by Syria because it retains in Lebanon forces that were welcomed by the U.S. and Israel in '76 to slaughter Palestinians. Congress and the press, in reporting the Syria Accountability Act, were somehow able to overlook the fact that Resolution 520, Center, which was passed in 1982, was explicitly directed against Israel, not Syria. And also the fact that Israel violated this and other Security Council resolutions calling for it to leave Lebanon for 22 years without any call for sanctions against Israel, or in fact even any reduction in the huge unconditional military and economic aid to Israel. Well, the operative principle was accurately formulated by a rare scholarly commentator, probably unique, Stephen Zunas. The principle is that the Lebanese government must be defended only if the occupying army is from a country the United States opposes, but is dispensable if the country is a U.S. ally. Again, the strong line of continuity. Well, since then, the Security Council has passed a resolution calling on all states to withdraw forces from Lebanon, implicitly meaning Syria that wasn't mentioned, which makes good sense. But U.S. support for it now keeps to the basic doctrine described by the director of the Carnegie Endowment Project for Democracy and Rule of Law, namely democracy and rule of law are just fine if and only if they conform to strategic and economic objectives. And here there's an interesting research project you might try. See if you can find us any exception to this doctrine or any recognition of its consistency or what that tells us about ourselves. Well, it gets to the one question about democracy promotion that I left out, namely within the United States. Highly important question, but topic for another time. Thanks.
Any questions? What should we do?
Well, I think the first thing we ought to do is to be concerned with democracy promotion in the United States. That could make a remarkably big difference. On almost all of these issues that I've mentioned and a whole host of others, the general population is strongly opposed to the bipartisan consensus. Just about every single one. So take, say, Israel-Palestine. Large majority of the U.S. population is and has long been in favor of the international consensus on a two-state settlement on the international border, which has been blocked by the United States for 25 years, 30 years now, unilaterally, ever since the U.S. vetoed the first such resolution in the Security Council in 1976. It never gets discussed. But despite the fact that it's never discussed, large majority of the population is in favor of it, like the rest of the world. Very broad international consensus. It's not the U.S. that's isolated. It's the U.S. government that's isolated from its own population. The actual data go beyond. They're much too important to be reported. But the major polling institution in the United States, the Program for International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland, which is really serious, in-depth analysis, the main academic polling institution in the world, about 2 years ago did a detailed study of popular attitudes on Israel-Palestine. They're pretty remarkable. So remarkable that they weren't publicly mentioned anywhere, as far as I could tell. So like the Globe didn't mention them, even though one of the participants is a former Globe editor. They found that a large majority of the population thinks that the U.S. should withhold all aid to either party, either Israel or Palestinians, unless they are negotiating in good faith for a two-state diplomatic settlement. Well, what that meant is withhold all aid from Israel, because Palestinians were in favor of it. Nobody knew that, of course, because it's not discussed. But that's what the numbers mean. What about, suppose both parties are negotiating in good faith, then same large majority feels that the U.S. ought to equalize aid to the two parties, to Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, that's so remote from policy, past or present, or from any political party or anything discussed that you can't even talk about it. It's a chasm. According to the latest results, the proportion of the population that believes the U.S. ought to tilt towards Israel in this conflict is 17%, 1/7. in other words, almost nobody, that it doesn't mean anything. Politics and popular opinion are totally divorced. The public is just out of the political arena, not just on these issues, but on a whole host of issues. In fact, the United States is what we call a failed state when we talk about other countries. That is a state that has democratic institutions, but designed so they don't function. The policies, population's out of them. So it seems true on Israel, on Iraq as well. So there's an interesting illustration of our quintessential faith in democracy that Hines was talking about. You recall that 2 years ago, March 2003, when the invasion took place, there was a big discussion in the United States about Europe, and a division was made between what was called Old Europe and New Europe. Old Europe are sort of the bad guys, mired in the past. New Europe is the hope for democracy, leading Churchillian figures like Jose Aznar of Spain and Berlusconi in Italy. Aznar, in fact, was invited to the summit where Bush and Blair announced the invasion of Iraq in recognition of his noble democratic credentials. There was a very sharp criterion that divided New Europe from Old Europe, very sharp. Old Europe, the bad guys, were the countries where the governments took the same position as the large majority of their populations. New Europe were the countries where the government overruled an even larger majority of the population and followed orders from Crawford, Texas. Therefore, they had democratic credentials. Actually, Aznar is a good example. In going to war, he was supported by TWO, 2% of the population. But he took his orders from Crawford, Texas. So therefore, he was a leading figure in New Europe, the hope for democracy. All of this passed without comment. Actually, it's worse than this, but I'll leave it there. Let's continue with Spain. Last March, things changed. There was a vote in Spain, and they voted the Aznar government out, and another government in. And at that point, Spain wasn't praised for its democracy. It was bitterly condemned for appeasement and, bowing to terror and so on and so forth. What did the Spanish voters actually vote for? Well, what they voted for was not withdrawing troops from Iraq, but withdrawing troops from Iraq unless they were under a UN mandate. Well, that also happened to be the position of about 70% of the American population, and had been for a long time. But the two crucial differences between Spain and the United States: in Spain, people knew that that was public opinion. In the United States, you could find it out only if you did an individual research project on it. Furthermore, in Spain, people were able to vote on it. In the United States, that's inconceivable. Neither political party or anyone closely connected to them or the media ever proposed or even discussed what a large majority of the American population wants in the case of Iraq, which in fact from a couple of months after the invasion had been for the UN to take the lead, not the United States, in economic reconstruction and political transition, and a couple months later also in security issues. That's a problem. What can we do about it? I mean, are we incapable of creating a democratic society in the United States? This is the most free country in the world. The only thing that stops us is unwillingness. There's no state repression to speak of. It's very marginal. There's no force. Freedom of speech is guaranteed in a way beyond any other country in the world. What's lacking is just will. Okay, so it means you got this very optimistic forecast. Do anything you like about it.
With the relation between states and freedom, are there differences between different states, or is there a consistent
with regard to freedom?
Yeah, states and freedom.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, let's take the last since the Second World War. I mean, among great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union were polar opposites in this respect with regard to freedom, internally, that is. On the other hand, if you look at the pronouncements of the Soviet leadership, including the worst Stalinist thugs, they're just, full of inspiring rhetoric about defending democracy. In fact, they probably believed it. One of the interesting revelations from the Russian archives, which, like everything else in Russia, have been sold off by the old communist bureaucrats after they turned themselves into a traditional third world elite 10 years ago. The big industry pouring over the archives, try to find something that can justify U.S. policies, and can't find much. But there are some interesting things. One of the interesting things is that internally, they talk to each other the same way they did externally. So these guys are, Stalinist monsters, are talking to each other about the need to protect the people's democracies of Eastern Europe from the fascist attack led by the United States, which was trying to overthrow democracy. I mean, if they're talking to each other that way with nobody listening, I suppose they mean what they're saying. And in fact, that's pretty common. But with regard to actual, say, preservation of freedom within Russia and the United States, about as far apart as you can get in among major powers. With regard to their actions elsewhere, it's a much more complex story. The U.S. has a much more violent history overseas. I mean, Russia was very violent, but within its own small region. The U.S. is a much more powerful state, and its violence and aggression were all over the world. There's millions of corpses attesting to that.
Why is Syria still willing to participate in our war of terror? Like, I'm thinking specifically of the example where we deported or flew the Canadian citizen over there, and supposedly he was, allegedly he was abused, tortured.
Not just allegedly.
Right.
In fact, he was sent there for that purpose.
Right, well,
to be tortured.
Sure, yeah, I mean, of course they'll deny it.
It's called rendition.
Right, it's sent there for that purpose. I mean, why are they still willing to participate in that sort of thing? And, I mean, do they take our saber rattling, seriously? And what do you think the chances of should we take it seriously? What do you think the chances that we might actually do something there or another country in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, when we refer to the war on terror, we also always ought to have it in quotes. I mean, war on terror is, people should remind you of what Gandhi is alleged to have said about Western civilization. Who knows if the story's true or not, but the story is he was once asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he's supposed to have said he thought it might be a good idea. And the same is true of the war on terror. It might be a good idea. But there's no evidence for any war on terror. And remember that the war on terror announced on September 2001 was actually redeclared. It was declared 20 years earlier by pretty much the same people and their mentors. War on terror was going to be the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. And I don't have to tell you what happened afterwards. But why would Syria want to cooperate in the so-called war on terror? It's kind of like Saddam Hussein wanted to. These are secular tyrannies, not radical Islamic tyrannies. They don't like the radical Islamists at all. In fact, they hate them. So they're willing to participate in this component of the U.S. war on terror, which happens to be directed against the forces that the U.S. and its allies organized, armed, trained, recruited in the 1980s for reasons of state, to weaken their global enemy. They were actually carrying out terrorist acts inside Russia in the 1980s. And that was fine. Kept supporting. When they turned against the United States, they became bad guys. But that's standard. And Syria agrees with that. I mean, they don't like them either. So they're willing to cooperate. If we want to torture people and make sure that the ACLU doesn't notice, you can carry out rendition to Syria or Egypt or other nice places where they'll torture them for you. Not that it isn't done in our jurisdiction, but there's always a danger that somebody will look. As for the saber rattling, everybody takes it seriously. I mean, it's a very violent it's a violent government altogether, but a particularly violent administration. It's got the whole world terrified. I mean, you look at international polls, fear of the United States is at unprecedented heights all over the place, and with good reason. On the other hand, if you want, I don't think the Pentagon could answer your question as to whether the saber rattling should be taken seriously. They probably don't know. But if you want a speculation, my suspicion is it can't be taken very seriously. And the reason is that it's very unlikely that the U.S. would attack anyone who can defend themselves. I mean, Iraq was a perfect target because it practically didn't exist. It was the weakest country in the region. It was being held together with Scotch tape. And what's amazing is that it took more than 3 days to conquer it. This is my guess. It would fall apart instantly. In fact, the failure of the American military occupation there is astonishing by historical standards. Should have been the easiest military occupation in history. I mean, the Nazis had much less trouble in occupied Europe. And the failures of it are really, by just historical standards, are pretty amazing. If you go to the non-embedded reporters, like the scattering of fine British reporters, they point this out. They say it's just an unbelievable. People who really know Iraq, Middle East, have been there for a long time, like Patrick Coburn and others, just amazed at how incompetent it's been, and it's actually succeeded in creating a militant resistance, which is remarkable. The partisans in Europe under the Nazis couldn't have survived if they hadn't had massive outside support. But this was created by the occupation. It doesn't have any outside support. They can't seem to get rid of it. Although it's not the important part of the resistance. The important part, I'm convinced, is the nonviolent part. So I don't think it's likely that the U.S. will attack, say, Iran. Syria is conceivable, although if they want to attack Syria, they'll use their Israeli client to do it, which would make more sense. Remember that Israel, though it's a small country, is a very powerful military force. I mean, according to its own estimates, Israel has air and armored forces that are larger and more technologically advanced than any NATO power outside the United States. By regional standards, they're just overwhelming. And they're also a major nuclear power and have other weapons of mass destruction. So that's conceivable. As for Iran, my guess is that the saber rattling is intended for another purpose. It's only been going on for several years, though it hasn't been reported here. So for the most important part of it is, for about the last 2 years, the United States has been sending over 100 advanced jet bombers to Israel. It already had the most advanced Air Force. Sending over 100 jet bombers, very publicly announced to be capable of bombing Iran and returning, and equipped with what the Israeli press calls special weapons, whatever that means. Whatever it means is intended for the ears of Iranian intelligence. They're supposed to make a worst-case analysis of it, and also for the ears of European intelligence. Because I think the goal of all of this is, I doubt if the goal is to attack Iran. If they're going to attack Iran, they wouldn't announce it so publicly for a couple of years, which just gives the Iranians chances to disperse targets and create defenses. But probably the goal, I suspect, is twofold. First of all, to try to provoke the Iranian leadership into being more repressive internally, which is likely if they feel threatened. And that would then stimulate efforts, which I'm sure are ongoing, to try to subvert Iran from within. If they could break it up from within and weaken it enough, then it might be a proper target for attack, but not as long as it can defend itself. So one effort is probably just to increase repression in Iran, which would then increase resistance and so on. And the other, which is working, is to frighten off Europe. The U.S. is very concerned that other powers are ignoring the U.S. embargo, the U.S. effort to isolate Iran. So Japan entered into a big contract a couple of years ago to develop a major Iranian oil field. India just did something similar. European corporations have been investing extensively in Iran. U.S. competitors don't like this. Obviously, they'd like to be there, but and also the U.S. government doesn't like it because it's undermining efforts to isolate Iran. Well, the saber rattling is having an effect on that. Major European corporations have pulled out, big ones like British Petroleum and Krupp Tyson and others, have pulled out because they just don't want to they don't want to anger the boss. It's too dangerous. And Japan backed off from its major contract. I can't find correct information about that, but it looks like it. So that's having its effects. You can read it in the business press, both isolating Iran and maybe contributing to subverting it from within by increasing repression. But I just don't think it's likely that they would be planning an attack while announcing it so publicly for several years. It doesn't make much sense.
I gather that you find it problematic that the U.S. foreign policy is centered around defending U.S. interests, So I'm curious as to whose interest you think we should be defending, especially in the multitude of cases where there isn't one side that's perfect and noble and democratic. Thank you.
Well, see, I said the opposite. I don't think the U.S. government defends U.S. interests. It defends economic and strategic interests, which are not mine and are not yours. Those are the interests of dominant power centers inside the U.S., which happen generally to be opposed to the popular interests. I don't see any reason why we should allow a government to act consistently to oppose the interests of its own population. In fact, and the government knows it. I mean, what's the point of lying all the time about the noble objectives? I mean, if they're protecting the interests of the general population, why not just come out and say so? Say, yeah, we're overturning democratic governments all over the world and installing tyrannies and carrying out aggression and murdering millions of people and torturing and so on, because we gain from it. Did you ever hear anybody say that? No, they don't say that because they know the population won't tolerate it. The point of doctrine and ideology and a lot of what goes on in universities and press and so on is to delude people, to make them think that their government is doing something they approve of, even though they don't. They oppose it strenuously, and in fact, if they knew about it, wouldn't let it go on. And part of the reason is they're just not protecting popular interests. Like, say, terror. I mean, does it defend the interest of the American public to take actions which you anticipate will increase the threat of terror in the United States? Yeah, it's outlandish. It's not the way you protect people in the United States. And the potential threat of terror in the United States is not slight. Read high-level government reports going way back. In fact, read MIT press publications going back to the 1980s, 90s, well before 9/11. I mean, they described scenarios for carrying out major terrorist acts, which probably wouldn't be beyond your capacities if you wanted to do it. MIT students. I mean, not very sophisticated efforts, which could be horrendous. And it's just a matter of time before nuclear weapons and terrorism come together. And the U.S. government is taking actions which increase those threats. Actually, that's the least of it. The so-called transformation of the military, Rumsfeld's transformation of the military, building up huge advanced military system, ownership of space for military purposes, all this kind of stuff. Just absolutely mainstream strategic analysts are writing in the most respectable journals, like the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that these programs are going to lead to, actually I'm quoting that journal, are going to lead to carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, the U.S. military buildup under Bush has virtually compelled Russia to rapidly expand its offensive military capacity in response. China, which has been the most restrained of the nuclear powers by far, is now building up offensive military forces as a deterrent. It's understood that the fancy technology being developed here will ultimately leak its way around the world and be directed against us. All of that Russia and probably China pretty soon are being compelled to put their offensive their nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles on hair trigger alert computer-controlled systems, launch on warning systems, which is just a recipe for disaster. I mean, our own systems, which are far more sophisticated, have hundreds of computer errors every year and are barely aborted by human intervention. There's 3 minutes allowed for human intervention. The Russian system are much worse. We're enhancing that, not you and me, but the government is consciously enhancing that danger because it just doesn't matter. I mean, the threat of destruction just doesn't matter. It's a low priority, just like the threat of terrorism. Same with environmental issues. I mean, is the government supporting your interests when it refuses to sign the Kyoto Protocol? In fact, is it going along with popular opinion? No. Popular opinion is overwhelmingly in support of signing. I think people care about whether their grandchildren are going to have an environment to live in. It's just of no importance to policymakers. They're not no importance, but very low importance. And you can go through case after case. So if the government were acting in the interests of the public, yeah, you can make a case for many of the things it does, not all. But that is academic. It's not government policy.
My question is about Lebanon. Since the assassination yesterday of the ex-prime minister, people have been taking to the streets. This small minority who was still with the Syrian presence in Lebanon has seemed to have joined the opposition in wanting to drive it out. If the opposition does succeed in getting the current government to resign and to drive Syria out of Lebanon, do you see the Lebanese government moving from Syrian puppets to becoming an appointed democracy by the U.S., especially that in the West, for example, France has been putting a lot of importance on, for example, finding the perpetrators and the legal and the reasons behind the assassination, whereas the U.S. has been talking almost all the time about Syria leaving Lebanon, otherwise force will be used.
Well, one shouldn't have any illusions about France, which has one of the most horrible records in foreign policy of any country. It just happened to be weaker than the United States, so it hasn't caused as much damage. But France is plainly trying to reassert its traditional influence and control in Lebanon. I don't think that's good for the Lebanese. The U.S. has its own interests in dominating the region and making sure that it's under U.S.-Israeli control. And I suppose the details of jockeying about this and that have to do with those goals. It's not only in Lebanon, other places too. Like take say Algeria. Algeria is was a French colony run with extreme brutality. In fact, the official French policy at one time was to exterminate, literally, the native population. In the years since so-called independence, France has been trying to reassert its position of dominance and control in the Algerian economy and even in the secret services. Pretty good evidence that French intelligence has been involved in a lot of the major atrocities of the last 10 years, a lot of them attributed to Islamists, but probably carried out by the security forces. Right now, there's a lot of conflict between the United States and France over who's going to control Algeria and the whole region of former French North and West Africa, which happens to be a big oil-producing region. In fact, the U.S. is getting, I think, about 17% of its oil from there, and it's expected to rise to maybe a quarter. France would like to keep control. The United States would like to kick them out. And these conflicts are going on regularly. You just read the business press, you can see them every day. And I suppose this, the Levant isn't, Lebanon itself isn't as important as the oil-producing regions, but it's right at the edge of them. And it's, that area has been central to oil politics for years. When the U.S., when Eisenhower sent troops to Lebanon in 1958, apparently equipped with nuclear weapons, that was the background concern there was control over the oil pipelines and oil transmission to the Mediterranean. It's a very good book on that by Irene Genzier, professor at Boston University, called Notes from the Minefield, about the U.S. 58 maneuvers. And undoubtedly that's going on now too. Nobody cares much about the perpetrators, but they want to increase influence and control.
Thank you, Professor, for this enlightening talk. My question is, when the U.S. is able to access the oil in the region, in the Middle East, why use the military?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, my question is, when the U.S. government is able to access the oil in the region, like for example the Saudis, why did they use the military this time? Why invade Iraq?
Why invade Iraq?
Yeah, when you can access the oil through.
Well, access has never been an important consideration. Anybody can access the oil. Once the oil is produced, it's out in the market. You can buy it if you have the money. Access has never been a major consideration. What's been the major consideration is control, which is not the same as access. So up until the early 1970s, the U.S. was not using Middle East oil. In fact, it was up till the late 60s, it was the major oil. North America is the major oil exporter. But U.S. policy was identical. The U.S. policy was to control Middle East oil resources. And if the U.S. were to shift to solar energy tomorrow, it would probably follow the same policies. You want to control it, for reasons that were stated very clearly and explicitly back in the mid-40s, long declassified, because quote, the energy resources of the Middle East are what were called a stupendous source of strategic power, the most strategically important area of the world, and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Well, you want to make sure that the material prize flows into the right pockets. That's not the oil, but the profits from it. And the strategic power means control. Control over the energy resources gives you what George Kennan, one of the top post-war planners, called veto power over what your rivals may do. Main rivals are Europe and by now Japan and Northeast Asia. Just a couple of months ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the more rational of the grand planners, wrote that the invasion of Iraq gives the United States what he called critical leverage over European and Asian economies. Iraq is the last place in the world where there is huge known energy reserves, which are untapped, unexplored, and very cheap. And all you got to do is stick a pipe in the ground and it comes out. You don't have to go through permafrost. You don't have to do deep sea drilling. You don't worry about tar sands. It's just sitting there. And nobody knows exactly how big it is, probably the second largest in the world or something like that. And having military bases right at the heart of the world's major energy producing region is a tremendous grasp on this, what they call stupendous source of strategic power. So that's, access is important, but it's not of major importance. Anybody can buy the oil.
We're running a bit late. Another question? Yeah.
I've been trying to understand like the groups like the neoconservatives and groups like the Project for the New American Century, and just trying to understand whether or not what we're dealing with are people who have like incentive as their
profit incentive
as the main like motivation for their activities, or it's like they're idealists who are like whose minds are like controlled by like Leo Straussian like ideals of necessary illusions and all that stuff. So like I know it's like silly to think that it's all ideology, but like it seems that like if it's more than just profit incentive, then
it's more than just. Profit and power are just, you can't dissociate them. That's why you have constant talk about economic and strategic interest. Strategic interest means dominance and control. Economic interest means making sure you got the resources, markets, profits, and so on that you want, and they're just indistinguishable. You can't separate them. As for the neocons, I think their role is exaggerated, frankly. Also, the PNAC documents. They're kind of interesting. They're not that different from the government documents. In my mind, much more interesting than they feel. The PNAC documents have a kind of feel that you're finding something secret. Where if you look at straight public government documents, you're just looking at what the government's telling you. But they're, I think, much more revealing. So, for example, the first major PNAC document was in 1992 or so. But take a look at the public documents right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was obvious that no more Cold War pretext. And that game's over. Don't pretend the Russians are coming. So just take a look at the most important national security strategy, maybe ever, but the one that appeared right after the fall of the wall, a couple months later, and the defense budget went along with it. They're very revealing, which I guess is why they're never discussed, and they're perfectly public. What they say is, okay, we're Russians, but we have to follow exactly the same policy. They say we still need a huge military system. Now the reason is not the Russians, it's, I'm quoting, the technological sophistication of third world powers. Okay, that's why we need it. Because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. And also we must, they say, retain the defense industrial base. Now, what's the defense industrial base? It's what pays your salary if you're an MIT. The defense industrial base is high-tech industry. And one of the ways in which the public is coerced into paying the cost and taking the risk of development of high-tech industry is by pretending it's defense. That's why you have computers and the internet and lasers and automation and just about anything else. It's called the new economy. It's produced at places like MIT with the public paying for it under the pretext of defense. If you look at federal spending, you'll notice it's shifted over the years from Pentagon to the health-related, like the National Institute of Health. Why is that? Well, because anybody with his head screwed on knows that the cutting edge of the economy for decades was electronics-based, and now it's becoming biology-based. So if you want to create the future profits for the next phase of corporate sector, you better get public to fund the biology-based industry. Okay, so all of that has to remain in defense industrial base. Furthermore, what about the Middle East? Yeah, it's quite interesting, the public document. They say policies for the Middle East have to continue, and then they say the Middle East where threats to our interests could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. So, sorry, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but the threats happen to be indigenous, as they always were, and they're indigenous nationalism. So now we can lay the threats Kremlin's door anymore, we'll have to continue with the same policies here. That goes on like that. I mean, that's real policy planning. The so-called neocons are kind of a fringe of it. They're sort of an extremist thing. And in fact, if you look at them, they're not really taken seriously unless their proposals happen to fit with much more centrist mainstream concerns. So they're nuttier proposals. This is right. For example, in 1996, Richard Pearl and Edward Case and a couple of the others had some program for reorganizing the Middle East. Actually, it was something that was submitted to the Netanyahu government. But that was kind of nutty. Nobody ever paid any attention to it. And they were going to they said, let's reestablish a harshness monarchy, on and on, off in outer space. So they disregarded. A lot of their ideas about China and Taiwan are very significant to them. They simply disregard it. They don't fit into major centrist strategic concerns and economic interests. Whether these guys actually paid any attention to what they studied with Strauss or not, I'm studied anything any different. But there's plenty of evidence about continuity in policy and planning right from standard mainstream sources. It's true that it varies. Like the Bush administration is in its in a lot of respects. It's what's frightened so many people. But if you take a look at the doctrines, they're not very different from the others. So Bush's preemptive war doctrine has terrified the whole world and aroused a lot of protests within the mainstream establishment in the United States. It's not very different from the Clinton doctrine in its actual meaning. Namely, when I quoted, using unilateral military force to secure control over markets and resources. In fact, the Clinton's doctrine is actually more expansive if you take it literally. You needn't require a pretext about weapons of mass destruction. But it was kind of like those Israeli differences I mentioned. It was done quietly, not screaming at everyone, not going out of your way to insult people, so keep quiet. And the policies stay within a pretty narrow range. This is not too surprising. The U.S. policies basically grow out of institutions. Individuals make differences, but they're fundamentally rooted in institutions. The institutions of power and domination in the United States are quite stable and changed for a long time. And they're very highly centralized in the corporate sector, which pretty much staffs and sets the bounds for government policy. It varies, and individuals differ, and sometimes differ in important ways. But the framework is extremely stable, and I think that's why you find the continuity in policy that the more serious commentators are talking about.
Mr. Chomsky, with the emergence of the European Union as perhaps the new world superpower, in the next 20 years, how do you see that as changing American foreign policy towards the Middle East? Because I know from living in Spain and visiting Italy, it's a very pro-Palestinian sentiment. And I know Spain has the best relations with Americans in the EU. So I see that as perhaps naive optimism that maybe we can change the American perspective. But how do you see that once it comes to economics with the EU and the States?
Well, the European Union is an economic power on the scale of the United States, and in terms of education and other criteria, life is bigger than and more important than the United States. It's the main difference in military.
That's the great thing. Right now, the EU just can't go against the United States.
Well, it can. It chooses not to. And that's because the leaders of the European Union don't really oppose U.S. policy.
Leaders of public sentiment.
Well, public, yeah, but you could say the same about the public in the United States. They don't like the policy either.
I think the public sentiment in Europe is much more educated.
Maybe. But, for example, Europe has granted rights to the central banks in the European Union that are so shocking that they're even attacked in the right wing in the United States.
But don't you think that in European standards, it's kind of like Germany is one of the, obviously it's one of the superpowers there, and its guilt over World War II kind of seems to stem off its foreign policy because it just doesn't want to have anything to do against Israel. You know?
I mean, why isn't the United States affected by its guilt over killing 4 million people in Indochina and destroying 3 countries? The reason is that only defeated countries have to feel guilt, just like only defeated countries have to be punished and have to look at their own history. If you're always victorious, you don't face anything. You can throw everything down the memory hole. So, in fact, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's used as a weapon against Germany to try to keep them in line. But huge atrocities by the United States don't affect anything. In fact, they're gone from history. Europe could go in its own direction. The United States has been concerned about this for 50 years. Back to the early days after the Second World War, U.S. planning, a lot of it was concerned with the fear that Europe might go off in its own direction. And so there's a name for it. It's called a third force. Europe might become a third force, independent of the 2 superpowers. And that's part of the reason for establishing NATO was against that. And there are a lot of things follow from that. I mean, like in 1952, Stalin actually offered to permit reunified Germany with democratic elections, which he'd be sure to lose, under one condition, that Germany not be allowed to rearm within a Western military alliance. Well, any Russian leader would insist on that for obvious reasons. Germany alone has practically destroyed Russia 3 times in a century. They obviously don't want them to rearm within a hostile Western alliance. Well, we don't know if Stalin was serious about that offer or not because the U.S. flatly rejected it. And we didn't consider it. And probably the reason was that it might be a possible outcome. I mean, if it turned out to work, there was a reunified democratic Germany, which, like you said, that's the heart of industrial economic Europe. It could lead to a neutralist third force, last thing the U.S. wanted. The U.S. is equally concerned about Northeast Asia, which has the second largest economy in the world, Japan, another major industrial economy, South Korea, China growing fast, maybe half or more of the foreign exchange reserves in the world. It's a potentially very powerful system. Furthermore, China and Northeast Asia are getting much closer relations with Europe, and the United States doesn't like that one bit. European last year's trade figures look as though, official ones haven't come out, but it looks as if the EU and China were each other's major trading partners last year, putting the United States in the shade. There's no doubt that Chinese students are flocking to Europe much more than to the U.S. now, and that tells you a lot about what's going to happen in the future. And the other relations are also being established. So yes, there are several. The world is roughly what's called tripolar economically, and has been for 30 years. 3 major economic blocks, roughly on a par, and this partially conflicting interests. Although European elites do not oppose the use of U.S. power to especially upstarts in the third world who might move towards independence. wouldn't even let anyone object much to what the U.S. says.
I have a question about Iraq. You mentioned that Shia-dominated political party supported by Ayatollah Sistani might actually have a chance of ruling the country. So my question is, if they do succeed, how do you think that would affect the relationship between Iraq and Iran? And how do you think Israel and the U.S. would react to a potentially strong alliance between
that's one of the reasons why I think it's extremely unlikely that the U.S. would tolerate an independent, sovereign Iraq unless it's really forced to. Just ask yourself, what are the policies likely for an independent, sovereign Iraq that's moderately democratic? Okay, well, it's going to have a Shiite majority, so they'll be influential. They don't love Iran, but they'd much rather be friendly with Iran than hostile to it. So they'll almost surely move towards improving relations with Iran, as in fact has been going on. Furthermore, they're very likely to reassert their position as a leading force in the Arab world. Iraq has every reason to be the leading Arab power in the Arab world for all kind of reasons, cultural, educational, everything, level of development. So they'll probably move back toward that position. Well, that's going to mean they're going to rearm, and they're going to confront the regional enemy, which is Israel. And it'll probably mean they develop weapons of mass destruction to counter Israel. Furthermore, even a loose alliance between Shiite Iran and Shiite-dominated Iraq might stimulate in the autonomous independence movement in the neighboring regions of Saudi Arabia, which happen to be Shiite, a large Shiite population, and that happens to be where most of the oil is. So pretty soon you're projecting what must be the ultimate nightmare in the United States for the U.S. government. The Shiite-dominated alliance which controls most of the world's oil and is independent, is confronting the regional enemy. The chances that the U.S. is going to sit there and allow any of this are pretty slight unless it's forced to. That's one of the reasons why I don't think that we can take, for all kind of reasons, we don't take very seriously to talk about sovereignty and independence and democracy. Maybe it's interesting and important, I think, how much the U.S. has been compelled to back down in case after case. How far will that go? It depends in part on things that happen in Iraq, but it depends in large part on things that happen here. If we're back to creating a democratic society in the United States. If the public can influence policy here, that could make a big difference.
Mr. Chomsky, considering the Israeli government's obsession with demographics, I was wondering what you think the prospects are for having a binational state or a one-state solution.
Well, I've actually advocated, I don't think a one-state solution makes any sense for that region, in fact, for most of the world. For most of the world, what you need is some sort of federal structure of the kind that are emerging in Europe, for example. So take a look at Spain. There's a lot of regional autonomy by now in Catalonia and the Basque Country and increasingly elsewhere. And that makes a lot of sense for most of the world. The United States is unusual. The U.S. is unusually homogeneous for a very simple reason. The native population was exterminated. It ends up being homogeneous. But if you look at parts of the world where the indigenous populations weren't just exterminated, there's all sorts of ethnic, linguistic, cultural, all sorts of other interconnections, which require, for a sensible political outcome, either federalism or something else. That's happening all over Europe, like Belgium, for example. It was basically run by nationalists. That's four conflicting groups. Broken up Catholic Protestants and French Dutch, four quadrants. And, if Belgium was in Central Africa, they would be murdering each other. But since it's a rich country, they sort of hate each other. But there are a lot of weird things going on. But most of the world is like that. And there's no doubt that the chance is that it makes no sense to have a single state in Cisjordan, Jordan, from the Jordan, the former mandatory Palestine. A binational state would make sense. Because they really just are, whatever you think about the origins, it's a fact that they're two different cultural, ethnic, linguistic, partially religious communities. It's just they're different. So some form of binationalism makes a lot of sense. I've personally been in favor of it since childhood. It used to be part of the Zionist movement. No, it's not. From 1967 to 1973, it was a very realistic prospect. Israel was in a position then where it could have introduced some kind of binational federalism. I was writing about it a lot in those years. In fact, the first talk I ever gave on it was at MIT, called Total Syria. But it was treated by everybody, Palestinians, Israelis, Americans. But it was, and the reason was because it was feasible. It could have done it. After 1973, it's a pipe dream. After 1973, the issue of Palestinian nationalism came on the international agenda and the Palestinian agenda, for that matter. And the only short-term settlement that makes any sense is some kind of two-state settlement. Now, a two-state settlement, anyone who's been in that region knows it doesn't make any sense at all. And to try to draw a line through that region is just totally crazy. But most state settlements are pretty crazy. They're imposed by force. And over time, if you could reduce the level of violence and hostility and begin to develop more reasonable relations among people that weren't restricted to ethnic, whatever you want to call them, lines, you could move towards some kind of federalism and maybe more integrated binationalism. I think that's a reasonable prospect. But to call for it's kind of striking that talk about a one-state settlement or a binational settlement has now become fashionable. So you can publish articles about it in the New York Times and in the New York Review of Books and so on. Whereas when it was feasible, it was utter anathema.
And I think the reason it's fashionable now is it's totally unfeasible. In fact, it's just a gift to the right wing in Israel. If the right wing in Israel and the folks in the United States can say, well, the only everybody just wants to destroy Israel, to kill the Jews. Okay, that's a victory for them. And that's, I think, why they welcome this talk. There isn't a chance in the world that Israel would accept to be integrated into a one-state structure now. And there isn't the slightest international support for that. If any international support ever developed, or support in the United States ever developed, and it became even a remotely realistic prospect, Israel would resort to the ultimate weapon to prevent it, and they have ultimate weapons. So this is like a gift to Sharon. He can then rally the people around him, saying, "Well, look, everyone who's opposed to us wants us to destroy us." That'll frighten people. That'll make them support the most brutal positions. My suspicion is that's why these proposals are now allowed, kind of tolerated and even sort of welcome. Whereas when they were realistic, they literally were anathema. You couldn't mention. Just take a look back at the 67 to 73 period when it was actually realistic. So yeah, I think it's a binational state system is in the long term, something to look forward to, but you just can't do it by, a flick of the wrist. It has to go through stages. Actually, a better solution, in my opinion, would be a no-state settlement. The whole region, not just Israel-Palestine, but that entire region is just a massive network of cultures, languages, religions, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the only people who had the right idea about how to run it was the Ottoman Empire. That's the way the Ottoman Empire ran. People were allowed to, fortunately, it was extremely corrupt, so it didn't bother people too much. It was brutal and all that. Nobody wants to restore it. But it was corrupt and weak, and so people were allowed to run their own affairs. And if you're in this corner of Beirut, you happen to be Greek, you can run your affairs, and somewhere else you do your things and so on. That makes a lot of sense for almost the entire world. apart from those regions which have become more or less homogeneous, usually by extermination. So that's a long-term goal to move towards, I think. But, again, you can't, these are kind of very academic discussions. If you want to advocate something like that, you have to have actual proposals as to how to get from here to there, and every one of them requires stages.
Father Chomsky, I'd like to ask you, is there a hope that the international community might be able to carry out the Bretton Woods Act in a manner that would actually, to carry out the Bretton Woods Act, to actually get it to be carried out in a manner that the elite, those in power, would actually have to follow it? I mean, I understand we have to exercise democracy in our country. And I understand a lot of people in our country are consumed by daily trivia and they don't pay attention or know what it even means. Like, they don't even know what it means, like words like morality or respect or whatever. But honestly, is there a way that we might be able to carry out the Bretton Woods Act and then have those other two forms of international legislation, the UN Charter, actually work effectively, and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually work effectively, so we have all this attention in Iraq, and then people in Sudan or Indonesia, they actually get help for these issues? I mean, is that, how might the Bretton Woods Act be carried out effectively?
The original Bretton Woods,
the original
UN institutions,
yes,
like the Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights.
Exactly, and then get rid of things like the Marshall Plan and the World Bank.
That's up to people like you. The things don't happen by magic. First, I don't agree with your negative feeling about the population. I think people are committed to the same values that you are. They don't know what to do about it, because it's a very atomized country. People are separated from one another. There's no organizations. There's no unions. They don't interconnect. They don't get any information. So people feel very helpless. But that can be overcome. We've, in the past, the United States has been a more democratic society because people work to organize it. If you don't do anything, that's what will happen. Power centers will run it. But we have every opportunity. There's no reason, for example, why the U.S. can't be as democratic as Spain, let's say, or as Brazil. After all, in Brazil, it's a much poorer country with tremendous poverty and illiteracy and a violent state and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, people were able to elect their own president, somebody from their own ranks, not somebody who was in skull and bones at Yale. Never had a higher education, in fact. A guy with background with a peasant, steel worker, union organizer, and so on. And they were able to elect him because they had ongoing, active, popular organizations. They have all kind of defects. You can criticize all sorts of things, but they exist. The Workers' Party doesn't just show up every 4 years and say, vote for me. It's working all the time, on local issues, regionally, everything else. The landless workers movement is probably the most important popular movement in the world. They're just active all the time, and they're kind of, orthogonal to the political system. They put pressure on it, but they're pursuing their own goals. That's the kind of thing that's the basis for a functioning democracy. It's not hopelessly idealistic to say that the United States could become as democratic as Brazil. In fact, it's scandalous that we even have to talk about it. We should be far more democratic. But people have to do something about it. It's not going to happen by itself.
This lecture series being about Syrian-Lebanese relations, I thought your treatment of the subject was brief and also oversimplified. And as a Lebanese who lived through the war, I find myself compelled to make a couple of clarifications. The first one is about the Syrian intervention in Lebanon, which you gave a sole reason for, which is to massacre the Palestinians.
No, that was the reason for the U.S.-Israeli support for it.
But what you failed to mention is that the Palestinians had been slaughtering Lebanese prior to that.
And the Lebanese had been slaughtering Palestinians.
They were slaughtering each other.
Yes, they were slaughtering each other.
And then the Syrians used that veil really to enter Lebanon because they had many other strategic reasons. And the proof for that is that long after the Palestinians have been controlled, the Syrians are still there.
Exactly.
That's what,
they have.
to clarify, if I may clarify, what I said is the reason the U.S. and Israel welcomed the Syrian intervention was they were coming in to slaughter Palestinians, like in Tel Aviv. And that's why the U.S. and
Right,
Israel
but I thought it's important that we should mention why Syria remains in Lebanon. I mean, the territorial claims, hijacking our foreign
goes way back.
policy, creating a economic free zone that they lack, etc.
And Syria has never accepted the great powers' decision after the First World War to break Lebanon off.
Right.
A decision between the French and the British.
Correct. The second point is that when you said that the U.S. Has turned a blind eye to the Israeli occupation, but opposed the Syrian occupation, and I beg to differ there also, because they didn't only turn a blind eye on it, they kind of let it happen.
They didn't let it happen. They actively supported it.
They actively supported it.
You're right. I mean, look, I wrote a long book about this in 1983, and I've written about it endlessly
right,
since.
But I think the audience should have benefited from this knowledge, because in 1991, when President Bush I was putting together his grand coalition to fight Iraq, was paying all kinds of prices to different countries to come on board, and the price paid to Syria, and it's not a secret, is a free hand in Lebanon.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's a ton of material of things that could be said about U.S., Lebanon, and so on. It just wasn't the topic.
Right. Well, I thought it was.
Okay. I mean, I started off by saying I'm not going to talk about Lebanon-Syrian relations, except tangentially.
Well, maybe it's my agenda. That one last point.
I agree with everything you said. I've written extensively about it for 25 years.
Right. Okay. Maybe you wouldn't agree with this last one. After the U.S. had sanctioned the Syrian presence in Lebanon for 15 years, suddenly they are now supporting the Lebanese to get rid of
supporting the Lebanese. They want to get rid of the Syrians so they can take over.
Right. So after September 11, what I have seen personally happening in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and this sudden interest in freeing Lebanon, calling on Egypt to democratize and Saudi Arabia to modernize, I feel that there is a strategic shift away from what you called a line of continuity. So I just invite you to
well, the line of continuity that I was talking about was in a book just published a couple of months ago, and it goes long past 9/11, and the continuity continues. Frankly, I don't think there's been a significant change since 9/11, except tactically, and tactics do change. But I think it's an interesting topic. One could have an evening on it. But my feeling, I'll just repeat, is that Carruthers is basically correct. The continuity goes on after 9/11 without any change, and I think what we've just seen in Iraq and in Israel-Palestine are just more illustrations of it. Same principles, the same quintessential faith, namely democracy and elections are fine if they come out our way. Other than that, we could discuss it, but I don't think it's been a major effect. And after all, if you think about it, I mean, there's no reason for policy to change after 9/11. I mean, the threat of radical Islamist terrorism did not become greater after 9/11. That threat was perfectly well known in 1993. I mean, in 1993, the same groups, organized and trained by the U.S., Islamic jihadis, tried to blow up the World Trade Center, came very close. If they'd had a little better planning, according to the building engineers, they would have killed tens of thousands of people. They had much broader plans. They were going to blow up the UN headquarters, the FBI building, the tunnels and so on. They were barely stopped in time. I mean, if you do rational risk analysis, the risk didn't change after 9/11. It's the same risk that's been there since 1993. I mean, visibly, like on the front pages, not the secret documents. So yeah, the risks were already there, as I mentioned. In the MIT Press was publishing books in the late 90s about the extreme dangers of jihadi-style terrorism in the United States. It's before 9/11. I mean, they knew about it. It's just not a high priority. Like it's not a high priority now. That's why invading Iraq itself shows that it's not a high priority. The Syria Accountability Act shows that it's not a high priority.
that undermines the effort to suppress radical Islamism. These are just not high priorities.
Professor Chomsky, my question is towards the U.S. support for Israel. I do not see what benefits the U.S. reaps from supporting Israel, and I wonder whether if they switch sides or they're less biased. I mean, would they reduce the anti-American aggression, and would they have closer ties with the oil powers? I mean, what does the American public gain from giving $10 billion a year to Israel and supporting it?
What does the American public gain by driving Russia and China to developing offensive nuclear missiles targeting the United States on hair trigger alert? The American public doesn't get anything from it. In fact, they're harmed by it. I told you what American public opinion is about aid to Israel. These policies are not taken because of American public opinion. They're taken against American public opinion. As for the policies, and that's a long story, I can't repeat it now, but I've written extensively about it, if you like. I think you can trace it right back to 1948, step by step. I think the basic policies are connected with having a network of what the Nixon administration once called local cops on the beat, local gendarmes who would protect the leadership of the oil monarchies from their own populations, from what they call radical, meaning independent domestic nationalism, and ensure that they do the bidding of the United States. And in order to do that, you need local cops on the beat. Police headquarters is in Washington, of course. There's a branch office in London. But the local cops are supposed to do a lot of dirty work. They were Turkey, the Shah, Iran was one, Israel, Pakistan for a long time. Pakistan was probably involved in crushing the Palestinians in Black September. It was protecting the Saudi protecting the Saudi monarchy. These states are what we're called kind of like a periphery pact, they're sometimes called, which kept the region under control. And they were all more or less allied. And they were allied with the Saudi monarchy, too. I mean, they don't object to it. They like it. By now, Israel's virtually an offshore U.S. military base. It's a major military power. The U.S. has major stored equipment there, close relations with it. It's a high-tech center closely integrated with a high-tech U.S. military-based industry. Connections are very tight. That's an important base for controlling the region. That's the way it's always been interpreted. And I think you could argue about whether the strategic design is correct or not, but it's been a pretty consistent policy. And also pretty explicit in the documentary record. So as far back as 1958, the U.S. intelligence was pointing out that what they called a logical corollary of opposing Arab nationalism is support for Israel as the one reliable U.S. base in the region. That policy wasn't implemented until after 1967, but after that it was. And again, you could argue whether it was strategically wise, but it's been a pretty consistent policy. And it's pretty much worked. The U.S. has maintained its dominance in the region.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.